So let's talk about the pros and cons of the teleporting Necrons of the Hypercrypt Legion. Which units are looking nastiest when they can warp from one side of the board to the other to get the jump on the enemy with some powerful shooting. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Necrons, and in this video I thought I'd do a focus review of the Hypercrypt Legion, perhaps one of the most interesting of the new detachments in my opinion. We'll talk through the general idea of the detachment, go through each of the rules in turn from the special rule to the stratagems and enhancements, talk about a few units that might be most interesting to make use of those special rules, and finish up with a few closing thoughts and a very rough army list idea. On the board, the Hypercrypt Legion is one of the more general purpose detachments in Codex Necrons, as just about everything can make use of its special rule, even if it is a bit more helpful to some things than others. These represent phalanxes of Necrons employing eldritch technology to phase from one location to another, Necrons being well known for their dimension hopping tactics, and this one does feel like it's a very lore appropriate fit to fit the Nephrek dynasty if you collected them. Their lore is that they're a rich Necron dynasty with access to some powerful technology that allows them to take on a golden form, beaming their warriors from one location to another in flashes of dazzling golden light. Not good news for enemies that thought they might be safe cowering behind cover or hiding in fortifications. For the rules theme of the detachment, the idea is that you basically get to repeatedly redeploy Necrons, warping to where you most need them. Very similar kind of rules to what the Grey Knights get, though a bit more emphasis on strategic reserves and turning up at the board edges, rather than just literally freely deep striking anywhere they want to each turn. Given that Necrons get a lot more powerful shooting options than the Grey Knights do, I feel like these rules still could be even more interesting for them though. In general, I feel like for the most part it helps out ranged units a bit more than melee, due to the 9-inch drop, meaning that you're not usually going to get a reliable charge after the hyperphasing, and it's a bit more flexible for anything that can natively deep strike, giving them far more positioning options on the board. As well as that, the detachment has a massive emphasis on monoliths, both helping out the options for redeploying units around the board, plus also giving them perhaps a surprising amount of stratagem support. Overall, I think it looks quite strong, and it perhaps should be a particularly interesting detachment for doing secondary objectives, as often that means jumping around the board to get to different locations to score those points. Getting into the rules proper though, and their primary special rule is hyperphasing. This one triggers at the end of your opponent's turn, so after they've moved or dealt damage or anything like that, and you get to select a number of units to return to strategic reserve, and you can do so with literally any unit in your army, whether it's a Catan or a Monolith or a squad of Scarabs or something. The only major rule is that they can't be within engagement range. At Incursion 1000 points level you can do it with 2 units, with Strike Force you can do it with up to 3, and Onslaught you can do it up to 4. I'd say that's quite a generous number. You can be redeploying a pretty large amount of your force each turn. As mentioned, I do think that this is really quite a strong rule. Usually it might mean that lots of units are going into strategic reserve and then turning up at the board's edges, so it's great for deep strike things that could just redeploy anywhere, and it's particularly great with a 1 command point stratagem that allows you to deep strike and drop just outside of 3 inches. I feel like that one's good enough in combination with this rule to get used just about every turn. Means that you can get some powerful shooting alpha strikes, suddenly getting line of sight with a whole bunch of Locust heavy destroyers with Gauss weapons for example, or lining up a bunch of Necron warriors with AP-1 lethal hits on their Gauss Reapers. And as mentioned, this one also does encourage the use of the Monolith, as you can bring strategic reserves in within 6 inches of that with its Eternity Gate, so infantry units have got a better option to return to the board there. Loads of options with this, whether it's jumping to objectives to claim them, moving around the board to do secondaries, or to gain line of sight on enemy units that would otherwise be safe, or even just putting enormous threats in the enemy backfield potentially, say for example moving Catan to there. Worth noting that as per the designer's commentary as well, if you have something that gets deep strike that returns to strategic reserve, you can redeploy it anywhere on the table. You do get to make use of the deep strike rules when you're deploying from strategic reserve. Moving on to the stratagems, there's broadly 3 types of them, 2 that fall under massive movement tricks that need a monolith, 2 that directly support the monolith in some way, and 2 that help units that are redeploying via the core mechanic. These 2 are the big movement tricks ones, Dimensional Corridor and Hyperphasic Recall, both of them costing 2 CP, so really quite pricey here. The Dimensional Corridor one is one that allows a unit that's arriving from a Monolith's Eternity Gate to go on to make a charge, provided that Monolith did start on the battlefield. At 2 CP it is pricey, but it's also really quite a big power play. As that triggers after the Monolith has made any move that it wants to make, you get to move the Monolith 8 inches towards its foe, then the unit could get out anywhere within 6 inches as per the Eternity Gate, and then make a ridiculously short charge against the enemy, maybe throwing something like a unit of Scorpec destroyers or Lich Guard right into the enemy's face. I feel like it'd be great if it was 1 CP. At 2 CP it's maybe just a little bit situational given the big cost. It's also a bit of a gamble to say have a unit hiding in strategic reserve to use this, just in case the Monolith might get gunned down. Otherwise, the other one is Hyperphasic Recall. This one triggers on an infantry unit that's just had one or more models destroyed in the enemy shooting phase, and that unit immediately teleports back to within 6 inches of the Monolith after the enemy unit has finished either shooting or fighting. It feels like a bit of a get out of jail free card for that unit that jumps back to the Monolith. I guess ideally you'd want to use that on a unit that's just jumped up, inflicts a bunch of damage on the enemy, and then the enemy is just about to light them up with a whole load of different damage. The first time that you lose a casualty to one unit, you can trigger it. Could also be a way of pulling units from combat or setting up a potentially quite short charge in your next turn. Say for example, if you had Scorpec destroyers charged in 1 dice, you could reposition them back to charge again in your turn. Definitely lots and lots of options with this one, but again at 2 command points it's going to have to be pretty good to justify that. Either one of these is pretty awesome though, and definitely gives loads more movement trick options to the Monolith, even beyond its Eternity Gate, which isn't bad in itself. This Legion has plenty of ways to get big Necron threats to pop up right next to the Monolith. Otherwise, just in case you hadn't grasped the message that the detachment wants you to take one, then there's 2 other supporting stratagems for it. Of these, I think the better one is Quantum Deflection. This one grants the vehicle a 4+ invulnerable save. Again, feeling very targeted towards the Monolith, given that almost everything else already gets a 4+ invulnerable save. It's still maybe just a tiny bit niche, this one. Say if your Monolith managed to have cover, then even las cannons will be saving on a 4+ anyway. I guess in theory you could use it on a Canoptet Reanimator or on a Tomb Spider or something as well, but they're maybe a little bit cheap to justify the investment. The other one for 1 command point is Entropic Dampening. This one means that one unit within 18 inches that's shooting at it makes all the unit's weapons gain the hazardous keyword, so they have the chance to blow a few of themselves up. I feel like that one's fun, but also just really not that strong. Each hazardous roll only gives you a 1 in 6 chance of a bad outcome for the enemy, so ideally you'd want a unit that's firing absolutely loads of individual weapons at you. Ideally multiple ones per model, and to have absolutely loads of models firing. I guess you could always look out for it, but it just seems super niche. Even if there's a good target for it about, they might just be shooting from greater than 18 inches away, or just not be targeting the Monolith at all. Next up, and easily the single best stratagem in the detachment, is Cosmic Precision. This one means that a unit in Deep Strike or in Hyperphase can drop anywhere that's outside of 3 inches of the enemy, rather than the normal 9, but they aren't able to charge when they do so. This is just ridiculously awesome combined with the main detachment rule. I feel like one of the major weaknesses of the detachment is that the enemy might just screen you out to 9 inches from a whole bunch of stuff. This means that you should be able to have at least 1 drop per turn if you want it, that the enemy isn't going to be able to do all that much about, particularly if the unit has a small footprint. You should be able to near guarantee a bunch of secondaries, like being able to do the ones in your opponent's deployment zone, like deploying teleport homers, have things turn up right next to enemies that should have been safe in cover and get line of sight with some heavy firepower, or potentially even throw a whole bunch of high objective control models onto objectives where the opponent's just towing onto the edge of the objective. On top of that though, it kind of gets even better, as the rules mean that you can get deep strike on units that don't actually already have it with this. So say for example, if you hyperphase something like a Catan Shard of the Nightbringer, or a unit of Locust heavy destroyers with the Gauss cannons, usually they'd have to turn up at the edges of the board in strategic reserve, but as well as dropping just outside of 3 inches of the enemy, this will also allow them to drop anywhere on the table, so it can be good for that too. Overall, I'd say this one gives you the single best value out of the detachment, and there's loads of nasty uses for it, both for scoring points and dealing damage. Finally, for 1 command point, there's Reanimation Crypts, which could be helpful but is maybe a bit more niche. Provided your warlord's alive either on the board or in reserves, then all hyperphased units that are in reserve still get to use reanimation protocols this turn, as usually they wouldn't be able to as they're off the board. This one does kind of depend on exactly how many units you have in the sky at that point and how damaged they are. I feel like for the most part it's going to be kind of low value if you're just getting D3 wounds back on a single unit, or even a bit passable if there's 2 units. I guess there's a high likelihood that you restore a model that's got some enormous threats like a Locust Heavy or a regular Locust Destroyer or something, then that could be extra nasty. As well as just getting the extra defense, you might be getting a bunch of powerful shots to hit the enemy with when they come back in. I guess you could just look at what you've got in the sky and consider whether it's worth it, I feel like quite a lot of the time though, maybe not. Overall for the stratagems, I do think that the Cosmic Precision one is the single best, otherwise most of them are usable. The Hazardous one is kinda niche, but Reanimation Crypt, Quantum Deflection, and the two big movement plays, they could all have enough value to be used, and the big movement tricks in the right situation could be absolutely game changing at the cost of 2 CP. Next up, we get to the enhancements. At time of recording, we still don't have the final points costs on these, but hopefully Games Workshop won't be too long on getting them out to us, though we can still know roughly what they do, even if their overall power might be a bit determined by how much they cost. The Osteoclave Fulcrum grants Deep Strike to the Bearer's unit. That's excellent in this detachment, as it just means they could redeploy anywhere on the board. Really big for a scary unit of ranged damage dealers, or even just teleporting a bunch of warriors up to midfield objectives. Being able to casually pop up anywhere is really quite nice, and you could even potentially use it for rapid ingress melee threats, things like Scorpec Destroyers popping up behind terrain and then getting easy charges after that. Dimensional Overseer is +1 to the number of units that can hyperphase if the bearer's either on the battlefield or in strategic reserve. I don't think it's bad, but depending on your army list, you might just not really need quite that many redeploys. 3 might be kind of adequate, and the fourth one that you're getting will be the lowest value out of any of the ones that you could teleport in and out. If you're wanting to play with loads of smaller units though, it might not be the worst. It does depend on how expensive it is though. Arisen Tyrant is an interesting one. You get to reroll hit rolls of 1 for the bearer's unit, and you get to reroll all hit rolls if they came in from reserves this turn. Pretty awesome for a shooting unit, really nice for warriors or immortals teleporting around the board. Probably particularly with either a Plasmancer or a Locust Lord who both give you the critical hits on 5+. Combine that with 4 rerolls and you could be getting some insane numbers of Tesla hits or a whole load of lethals with Gauss. Finally, we have the Hyperspatial Transfer node. This one's an auto advance of 6 inches. This one maybe feels a little bit more tame, and I'd hope that to be a fairly cheap one. Could be interesting to have with Tesla Immortals, though it does kind of compete with that new Overlord with the Translocation Shroud. If you were including an Overlord in the unit anyway, it's going to be kind of redundant, as you could just take that. I guess could allow you to have 2 such auto-advancing units with maybe some Immortals moving on to midfield objectives and still firing off with their Tesla carbines if you'd like to. Overall, I do quite like the enhancements. The Osteoclave Fulcrum, unless it's obscenely costed, seems amazing, and Arisen Tyrant is a very nice damage boost. If it's cheap enough, then the reroll hit rolls of 1 just really aren't all that bad just in themselves, but really I think you'd want to be using it on a unit that's jumping on and off the board, getting some full hit rerolls guaranteed. Moving on to interesting units for the detachment, and I think it kind of makes sense to start off with the Monolith. 350 points pre-Codex, and it hasn't really been changed all that much. I'd argue that it's probably slightly better than it was before. It dropped to Toughness 13, but went up to 22 wounds. Overall, that's probably an upgrade, as it's only going to be relevant against the very specific strengths of 7 and 14. They're just not all that common. And its movement got slightly boosted up to 8 inches. Not the worst when it's a fairly good power piece for this detachment, giving you more options with where your hyperphase units can come back via its Eternity Gate. Otherwise, it's got some okay shooting damage between the particle whips and a bunch of death rays for some anti-tank. It can deep strike if you want to hyperphase to redeploy the monolith itself. That might depend on exactly where your opponent's units are and whether or not there's a good, better location for it to be. And that Eternity Gate is relevant only for infantry, so you couldn't do it with things like, say, heavy destroyers or things. It'd be most relevant for the Necron elites. The Eternity Gate is useful for pulling units out of combat as well, as that's something that the hyperphase detachment isn't able to do, so that does cover a different niche there if you want to use it for that rather than deploying a reserve unit from it. You could potentially even hyperphase the monolith itself and then still use the Eternity Gate special rule in the same turn. Again, that could be an interesting way of getting some scary units right up close to the enemy, though they wouldn't be able to charge. It is kind of interesting, and I feel like the logical thing to do would be to take a monolith, though I do feel that having just one enormous big strong anchor type unit maybe is a little bit at odds with the rest of the detachment, warping things around the board and being sneaky. If the opponent doesn't have the heavy anti-tank guns to deal with it fairly early, then it's probably a big win. If they do have just a ridiculous amount of focused fire, losing it could be a big blow to your options, as it's likely to take the absolute heat of enemy damage. Otherwise, for more relevant units within the detachment, these are all the Necron units that get the Deep Strike keyword. Some may be a little bit more relevant than others. I feel like Deathmarks will absolutely love this detachment. They feel like one of the single best units that could use this. Each currently 13 points for a single Strength 5 AP2 damage 2 shot, good for killing some Space Marines, and does have the potential to snipe some characters, and it's quite a nice cheap unit to drop to do secondaries as well. 65 points to be able to just come down and then do a secondary, and then have the hyperphasing option to go and do things later in the game in the same way. That also seems big. It's probably a bad idea as they don't really deal with toughness 6 or higher very well at all, but you could in theory get 30 death marks for 390 points and then just have them walk round the board each turn, just setting up somewhere to act as a massive deletion laser to gun down a couple of key enemy units, or hopefully putting somewhere where they're not going to get the absolute brunt of the enemy firepower due to their good range. Probably a dumb idea, but when you get to that amount of things redeploying and striking, you could potentially just have enough damage to overwhelm one section of the board, or have the chance to gun the opponent off an important primary. Otherwise, the Hexmark Destroyer could be an interesting secondary objective doer as well, with Lone Operative, even if his rules were toned down quite a lot in the Codex. Triarch Praetorians are interesting as a mixed range of melee damage dealer. They feel like they could be an interesting enough deep striker type unit to use those Monolith tricks, or maybe even rapid ingress. They do hit with quite a big flurry of attacks, and the particle blasters have a lot of devastating wounds going for them. The Transcendent Catan can pop up anywhere. I feel like there's maybe a little bit of overlap with his own redeploy rules here, though I guess the Hypercrypts could mean that he could threaten a charge at the same time as he redeploys, which he can't if he's advancing normally. Otherwise, the Monolith we've already talked about, the Obelisk isn't really going to get a look in, even if it was quite as good as the Monolith, as the Monolith has all the redeployment things it does, and Ophidian Destroyers kind of feel super redundant in this one. Not enormously powerful on their raw stats, but they get that fairly nice redeployment move. Just seems a bit pointless if the rest of your army can do it. Otherwise, you could use that deep strike enhancement to be able to deep strike things as well. Basically, any ranged damage dealers look like a good target for that. I feel like Locust Destroyers or Locust Heavies with a Locust Lord attached would be a pretty strong choice. With short range but really quite a lot of threat, they seem like a really good choice for redeploying, and hopefully landing somewhere pretty optimal where they can destroy their targets but not take as much enemy return fire as they would have otherwise. Otherwise, Necron Warriors or Immortals could allow themselves to get within close range, maybe to use Gauss Reapers. They've got a lot of objective control, and I feel like if you're being very brave, you could even put it on something like a Scorpet Lord leading some Scorpet Destroyers. That could give you a pretty monstrous rapid ingress type threat, or you could also threaten to have them jump out of the Monolith's Eternity Gate and then set up a charge. That one would cost you that 2 CP stratagem though. Otherwise, even beyond Deep Strike, anything coming out of Strategic Reserve can still have some value, though it might have slightly diminishing returns if the opponent is able to screen well. Things like the Doomstalker and the Doomsday Arc being able to reposition via hyperphasing could be nice. If they can't stand still to get their buff damage, then at least they can get pretty optimal positioning. And I guess the same goes for the Locust Heavy Destroyers as well. I think they've got enough range to still be great turning up on the edges of the board. Catan seemed like another really powerful thing to move around the table, even if they're not going to be inflicting maximal damage on the turn that they come in. I guess if you're just coming in from Strategic Reserve with something like a Nightbringer or a Void Dragon, they could still have the low chance to make a 9-inch charge, which would be pretty terrifying even if it's not guaranteed. Or you could just drop an incredibly terrifying Catan in the enemy backfield with that 3-inch deployment stratagem and give their backfield objective holders a threat that they really can't handle, and make the enemy's damage dealers have some tough choices as to whether they move back to deal with it. While all the redeployment is great, I'd say you can't really afford to redeploy everything each turn, and it might well make sense to have some units that are a bit more geared to just being tough on midfield objectives, as you're going to want to have something still nearby to be able to score primary objectives, as anything that you're redeploying will be off the board at the time when primaries are typically scored. Necron Warriors with Cryptex could be quite nice, maybe Immortals or Wraiths with Technomancers. I guess the Monolith itself could contribute 8 objective control to a central point, and that might help a bit. That feels like it'd probably be the boring part of the list, but maybe kind of necessary for winning the objective game. Finally, maybe having a few small units of objective grabbers, particularly death marks, could be good. 65 points for a free deep strike dropping units to be able to threaten to jump into the enemy backfield late game could be good for doing things like deploying teleport homers or popping up to cleanse objectives. They seem quite well suited to that. Overall, from first takes, I feel like the Hypercrypt Legion is looking like one of the most interesting Necron detachments. Besides the Awakened Dynasty, which still seems to be a solid choice, I'd rate this and the Canoptech Court as perhaps the most interesting out of the newer ones, and this one is certainly playing Necrons a very interesting and different breeze. I'd mainly be aiming to be lining up massive ranged alpha strikes on the enemy in one portion of the board bit by bit, and making heavy use of that cosmic precision to drop just outside of 3 inches to put some powerful stuff exactly where it shouldn't be. For advantages of the detachment, it means that ranged damage dealers can get some pretty godly positioning each turn. You should be able to score secondary points really easily, and at the end of each opponent's turn you're going to have a lot of options for clever tactical plans between the core mechanics and the stratagems. It's going to reward the person who's most familiar with it and is able to see the best path to victory. For potential downsides, it means that enemy armies that have loads of board control might be able to screen you really well and push loads of your units all the way back. You should be able to get one unit somewhere nasty each turn with the 3-inch deep strike stratagem, but beyond that, if the opponent screens really well, you might not be able to be landing in the backfield, or might have your main damage dealers hitting some enemy chaff for the first few turns. Otherwise, it doesn't really give you a whole load for direct damage and defense, besides that Arisen Tyrant option, which is quite good admittedly. It's not a detachment that's going to help you loads with the primary objectives for the most part, and besides a couple of expensive tricks like bringing them in close or rapid ingress, it doesn't really help out melee Necrons either. If you do go down the expected route and take a Monolith as well, losing it could potentially be a really big blow and shut off a whole load of your stratagem options, though provided you've got a fair few scary deep strikers out there, it's probably not the end of the world. Here's just one very rough list idea that almost certainly isn't going to do anything too optimal, but just goes heavy on a bunch of Necrons with a whole load of fun guns. This one's using the old points pre-Codex, as we don't know how much things are going to change. I wouldn't be too surprised if the Catan Shard went up a bit, and I've estimated the enhancements at 20 points, again we'll wait and see there. In any case, for fun warping shenanigans, there's a Locust Lord with an Osteoclave Fulcrum. He's leading 6 Locust Destroyers to be able to teleport in range, and hopefully using their big rerolls to destroy any units that are holding midfield objectives. He's backed up by a slightly obscene amount of anti-tank destroyers, 2 units of 3 with a heavy Gauss and 1 unit of 2. They'll be trying to loiter in the backfield at long range and try and stay safe and outrange the enemy if possible. If they find themselves without particularly good targets for a turn, then hopefully hyperphasing, and cropping up somewhere where their presence is going to be felt with those terrifying damage 6 guns. For a unit of slightly durable objective control, there's a unit of 20 warriors, 19 with Gauss Reapers and 1 with a Gauss Flayer, him to hopefully trigger the move-shoot move of a Chronomancer if it matters, aiming to get themselves onto a midfield objective early and being somewhat tough to remove there. And a unit of 10 Immortals with Tesla with the Plasmancer with an Arisen Tyrant rule. They could be a potentially interesting unit to have stepping out of the Monolith, or pull back to it with the Eternity Gaze if they happen to wind up in combat, and whenever they get 2 set up from reserves they get 4 rerolls to hit with sustained hits on a 5+. Should be able to stack some saves, and particularly against things on objectives, and they could be interesting to redeploy within 3 inches towards the enemy home objective as well, to clear out any enemy infantry that are hiding there with low saves. There is a sturdy Monolith to make its way towards one objective, maybe supported by the Warriors or the Immortals, 3 units of 5 Death Marks to drop 4 secondaries, and then hopefully disappearing again to zoom round the table to hit the things that most need it. And finally just an all-round scary Catan Shard of the Nightbringer with the 5+ Feel No Pain. He'd be a prime target for using that 3-inch drop stratagem on to put him somewhere to make a nuisance of himself. He's tough enough to take the enemy counter-attack provided he's not exposed to literally everything, and that's be a great way of getting around his fairly slow 6-inch move. It'll be interesting to see what actually gets used in competitive tournaments and things. This one's just a few fun ideas, and there's perhaps extra reason not to take it too seriously when we don't know official points costs. Let me know what units and things you'd be wanting to put in this detachment if you are running it though. In any case, let me know what you think of the Hypercrypt Legion. Would you be tempted to try this out as an alternative to the Awakened dynasty, or has one of the others caught your eye more? If you enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day, and I'm sure I'll have more for the Necrons. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.